It is said that the best working propaganda is the one we don't notice, the one that manipulates us in ways we don't even suspect, introducing into our minds a small idea that eventually grows and we perceive as our own. And think about this, whenever we think of propaganda, we immediately think of that time during World War II, where the German government manipulated opinion by exalting certain cultures and denigrating others. But many forget that the United States also used propaganda during the war, and that superheroes became the perfect vehicle to convey their ideals of power. Did the propaganda in superheroes end after such images stopped circulating in comics when the war ended? Or did it simply change so much that we don't even notice it anymore? That's what we're going to talk about in this video, how these characters have historically been used for propaganda purposes, the ideas they propose, and above all, the new forms they have adopted. My name is Go, the Geek Monitor, and today we are going to take on the propaganda movie.
Propaganda can be subtle or even unconscious.
Did you notice that? It was as if someone wanted to get into the video. Could it be a collaboration? The historical context is crucial when discussing propaganda. When Superman made his first appearance in 1938, the United States had just come out of a great economic depression, so the Man of Steel was presented as a champion of the oppressed, of the common people, and that's why in his first stories he didn't really face monsters or supervillains, but corrupt politicians, mining companies, and even stock market speculators. The stories changed with the context. In the compilation book Superman: The War Years, writer Roy Thomas recounts that when the character's first stories began to come out, the United States was not yet officially involved in World War II, but the news of it was increasingly impacting people, so Superman's stories gradually began to introduce conflicts that the Man of Steel solved in fictional countries like Boravia, which already had a very European sound. It was a way in which Superman could get involved in the war without fully entering it. This would soon change, as Superman ended World War II in 2 pages. On February 27, 1940, Look magazine, a rival of Life magazine, signed a contract with DC Comics to publish a story where Superman arrives in Germany, easily defeats its army, and captures Adolf Hitler. I would love to give you a non-Aryan punch in your jaw, but there's no time for that. You will come with me to visit a friend of yours. Superman arrives in the Soviet Union soon after. He captures Stalin and brings his 2 prisoners before the United Nations, who declare both dictators guilty for unprovoked aggressions against defenseless countries. Keep in mind that at this point in history, the United States hadn't even officially entered. Remember, this comic was not released as a children's comic book, and it covers the war, but in a widely circulated magazine. So we have to ask ourselves, what was the magazine's intention in paying for a story like this? What did they gain?
They gained not only attracting Superman fans to read the magazine, but also people starting to associate the magazine with the values and symbolism that the Man of Steel represents. But what specifically do superhero figures have that makes them so important? Why did they manage to transcend the comics they were born from to become a force that also accompanies us day after day? And even though that's no longer their goal, why in 2024 can superheroes still be great propaganda tools, and not only that, but also continue to talk about political issues?
Yes, just as you're thinking, this story worked as propaganda. But it's worth pausing and asking ourselves, what is propaganda? Propaganda is a way of transmitting information that seeks to influence people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors towards a cause or ideology. In other words, it seeks to convince people of something. And it often uses persuasive techniques such as emotional manipulation and the distortion or selection of facts to better convey a specific message. What could be the message behind this comic? Convey the idea that the United States should enter World War II, a message that was replicated through many other comics, characters, and covers like these others, where we have a symbol of American power that stops the war with ease. But it's worth noting that, as strange as it may sound, propaganda does not always have negative purposes. For example, environmental care campaigns often have elements of propaganda, as they seek to generate empathy and awaken strong emotions in us to convince us to change our way of acting and thinking. Here, for example, we can't say that the purpose is negative because it's about taking care of our planet, but the way that information is presented has more to do with propaganda and less with advertising. So what distinguishes these 2 concepts from each other? concepts. The biggest difference is that advertising has a specific purchase purpose. That is, it has a very clear and specific commercial purpose, promoting certain products and services to generate sales, while propaganda has more to do with influencing ideas. So it is often used for political or religious purposes, or political religious ones that frequently go together. However, the line between advertising and propaganda is not always so clear. In fact, the person who wrote the book on propaganda, and I really mean literally the book called Propaganda, worked both in advertising and overthrowing governments. Edward Bernays was a pioneer in the field of modern propaganda and applied concepts from his uncle's psychology and psychoanalysis, a man named Sigmund Freud, to mass persuasion. He believed that emotions and desires could be harnessed to influence people's behavior, so he worked on very successful campaigns like the Torches of Freedom, a campaign funded by tobacco industries that sought to get women to smoke more. What did Bernays do? Far from promoting any particular brand, he linked some feminist ideas like freedom with cigarettes, implying to people that an independent woman is one who chooses to smoke. Bernays also linked eggs with bacon to good health, which made us perceive this breakfast as traditional and nutritious, and influenced the Central Intelligence Agency to overthrow the Guatemalan government of Jacobo Arbenz, who wanted to redistribute agricultural lands among the peasants, something that the United Fruit Company did not like, so they started an anti-communist campaign against the Guatemalan president. That's how tough Bernays was. Hey, do you consider yourself an independent woman?
Well, yes, we live in the modernity of the 20s. I can already vote and my working conditions are improving. I am very sure that we will soon achieve the same freedom and rights as men.
No, but I'm talking about the true freedom that smoking gives you. That freedom that Power to Light gives you. To light a cigarette like a true independent woman.
But I don't like the smell of cigarettes.
Well, I'm just saying that all independent women are the ones who smoke. So if you don't smoke...
I can't find any flaws in your logic.
In the case of superheroes and propaganda, they were initially used to sell the idea that the United States was a symbol of power that could easily stop the Axis powers. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the United States officially entered the war, superhero comics served to maintain morale and inspire troops through these images that represented courage and heroism. In fact, the government itself distributed comics among the soldiers because they were aware of the inspiring effect they had. After the war, patriotic messages in superhero stories vanished. However, superheroes are still being used for propaganda purposes. Many people wrongly believe that superhero stories are becoming more political and ideological. However, there are old Spider-Man comics that already had strong ideological influences. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko wrote the first Spider-Man stories. However, as the issues went by, both writers clashed more and more. So Stan, annoyed, increasingly ceded control to Steve, who was a big fan of Ayn Rand and her philosophy called objectivism, one that exalts, among other things, the use of reason and individualism, as it believes that each person should live under their own rules and for their own benefit and happiness rather than sacrificing their interests for the good of others, an ideology that was more linked with the conservative and capitalist ideas of that time. These ideas were consciously introduced into the Spider-Man comics, which made Peter behave strangely, like when Peter looked down on some protesters because he basically tells them to get to work. In the stories that seem to endorse police violence against criminals, and in the fact that Ditko did not want Norman Osborn to be the Green Goblin because he did not like the businessman being put in a bad light. Stan Lee, being more liberal, disliked these changes, eventually leading to Ditko leaving Marvel. However, he began to write stories with more direct objectivist messages, like his character Mr. A, an individualistic vigilante who believes there are only good and bad acts, with no gray areas. This character faced villains who controlled minds, which referred to the collective mentality and served as inspiration for Alan Moore's character Rorschach. But it was not as a tribute, rather Alan Moore detested objectivism. He created Rorschach to mock him. And years later, Zack Snyder glorified him in his film Watchmen, turning the parody into a symbol of resistance. Life's ideological turns. Another very emblematic case that has to do with using stories to change people's ideas has to do with Batman's gay controversy. In the 1950s, psychiatrist Frederick Wertham claimed that Batman was detrimental to children as it encouraged homosexuality, among other assertions. He used panels like these as examples where Batman and Robin's relationship could be misinterpreted. The situation escalated, leading to mass burning of comics. The government held hearings with industry owners, resulting in the creation of the Comics Code, which was an organization that censored and regulated comics so they wouldn't have dangerous messages, basically gay, communist, and violent ones. That's why, to change the perception people had of Batman, they introduced Katie Kane, the first Batwoman, into his stories. A character who would serve as the Dark Knight's romantic interest, who had the conscious intention of telling people holy heterosexuality. Look how masculine Batman is. Ironically, the comic that ended the Scout comic many years later would also have some propaganda in it. In 1970, the United States Health Department asked Stan Lee to please write a comic about the dangers of drug use. Stan agreed and wrote a story in which Harry Osborn endangers his life after consuming a dangerous substance. However, the Comics Code rejected this story because drugs could not be mentioned even to say they were bad, as this story did. So Marvel published the comic without the Comics Code's seal of approval. To everyone's surprise, there were no negative consequences. There were no complaints, comic burnings, fines, or cancellations. So other companies like DC Comics also started to get into more political issues. This is when many other writers began to introduce their own political ideas into the stories. Now pay close attention here. As we said before, this does not mean that comics were not political before this. I'm saying this was the point where writers began to introduce their own point of view more openly into the comics because there was no longer a censoring body in play. However, this does not mean that these stories laden with ideological or political viewpoints are necessarily propaganda. Most of the time, writers introduce these themes into the comics to give superhero stories some relevance and realism. And since we all have a social and political viewpoint, it's normal that the stories we create also have it. In the 1970s, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams created Green Lantern and Green Arrow comics, where Hal Jordan, the conservative, and Oliver Queen, the liberal, faced various problems like racism, religious extremism, and drugs, each with a different worldview. While Frank Miller in his comic The Dark Knight Returns talked about Superman as a puppet who obeyed the government, while Batman represented this libertarian spirit that opposed it, while Before Vendetta is a comic that openly opposes fascism and the conservative regime of Margaret Thatcher. Just as it works in many other mediums such as literature, cinema, etc., artists talk about what they know and their art reflects their way of seeing the world. This continues to happen. After the 9/11 tragedy, several superhero stories began to talk about this dilemma of how much freedom are you willing to give up in exchange for security, a discourse highly relevant at the time due to the United States of America Patriot Act, a law that expanded the government's capabilities so they could supposedly better combat the threat by allowing them to spy on civilian phone calls or arrest suspects without having solid evidence. Does it sound like you've seen it in some story? During the Civil War, Iron Man and Captain America fought over control and restrictions versus keeping their secret identities, with each taking opposing sides on the issue. Does this mean that this story was a propagandistic commission from the government? Rather, I feel that Mark Miller had these themes in mind and used them to tell a socially relevant story.
Propaganda can be indirect or even unconscious, and Christopher Nolan exemplifies this well.
Of that, we are the entertainment. I am
saying that Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy is bad, or that it's pro-Trump, or that it's right-wing, or anything like that. In fact, only The Dark Knight Rises received help and funding from the American militia. The other two did not. However, Christopher Nolan wanted to make a version of Batman that felt realistic and relevant in a time period that was between 2005 and 2012.
Now, does this mean that there is no longer propaganda in superheroes? I didn't say that. Superhero stories still contain propaganda and there's clear evidence of it. What does this propaganda seek? No, it's not about putting more gays in movies, but rather making the army look good. And it's because the United States Department of Defense has a division responsible for reviewing, approving, and even co-writing many of the movies we see. Cinema allows this because the Department of Defense provides funding and lends military facilities and equipment to movie companies, saving them money. Movies like Iron Man, Captain Marvel, and Wonder Woman 1984 have accepted this deal. This tactic has proven very effective. After the release of the 1986 film Top Gun, one that was partially funded by the government, the military recruitment rate increased by 8%, and for decades they have had a budget dedicated to supporting cinema, as long as they allow them to make a modification here and there. And this is no secret, you can go to the official government website and read about how the military works with Hollywood. In fact, there is a text on their official page that talks about what it's like to collaborate with film directors that goes like this. Both sides have made commitments, but at some point we must insist on our terms or walk away from the deal. These practices certainly fall into the realm of propaganda, especially because they are basically big ads that we didn't even know we were watching. Now, what other kind of propaganda do we currently see in superhero stories? We can discuss how many recent plots and characters involve China, as it is now a highly significant market. Or we can also talk about how many politicians use references to superheroes to give a positive image. Unfortunately, these topics warrant a separate video. Luckily, my friend Becca Salas and I have a prepared one for you. You can watch it on her channel right after this video, as it's already published. It's the perfect complement to the information in this video.